And it's my pleasure today to welcome all of you and an excellent panel of Egyptians and Egyptian experts to talk about the situation in Egypt and the future of democracy in Egypt. As we all know, today or this week marks exactly 6 years of the beginning of the Arab Spring. It was 6 years ago. It's been a tough 6 years for majority of these countries. Certainly Libya, Yemen, Egypt, and Syria have been going through very difficult times. But I think that we have learned many lessons and we continue to learn. And the first lesson is that dictatorships are not stable. We have seen how quickly they left and how quickly they fell down when the people came out in the streets by the millions in each of the capitals. So if we want stability and development in the region, we certainly will not have it by having dictatorships or oppressive regimes. The cause of extremism, the cause of violence is lack of opportunity, is lack of hope for the majority of young people in the region. That's why we need democracy, we need freedom, we need a sense of dignity for young people, we need a sense of hope for young people. And that's why the Arab revolutions happened 6 years ago, and that's why I think they will still happen again, because the problems or the underlying causes are still there in each of these countries. And that's one lesson that I hope we have learned, that we need democracy and we need to work for democracy. The other lesson that I think we learned, and we learned it both from Egypt and as well as from Tunisia, is that the only democracy that works is an inclusive democracy. There is not a single party that is capable of ruling Tunisia or Egypt or any of these countries. The only way we can build a real democracy if we all work together, if all the parties put aside their differences and work together to build a new system of government, a new democratic order that includes everybody and that has a sense of compromise. Nobody can force their opinion on others. Nobody can exclude the others from participating in the political process. So I hope that we have learned these lessons, but I am sure that people in the Arab world will continue to struggle and fight for freedom and for democracy. I hope it happens peacefully, because violence is certainly not the answer. As we also learned that violence always makes things worse, that these opposition movements or revolutions or demonstrations need to be peaceful, but that unless we solve these underlying problems and underlying causes, the situation in the region will continue to be very fragile and very unstable. So with these few introductory remarks, I'm very happy to welcome 4 well-known and respected experts on Egypt and the region. You have their biographies in the paper outside, so I will not read it, but Dr. Shadi Hamid is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Professor Sahar Aziz is professor of law and Middle East and legal studies at Rutgers University. Professor Dalia Fahmy is associate professor of political science at Long Island University, and Daanish Farooqi is currently a PhD candidate and a visiting scholar at the Center for Study of Genocide and Human Rights at Rutgers University. He's a doctoral candidate at Duke University. So I think we will have a very interesting, and they recently published a book with the same title as we have chosen for today. So they will be presenting the results of their book, and then we will open it for discussions with the other panelists as well as with you. So let's start with Daanish. Try to keep it for 10 minutes each, so we have time for Q&A. And you can come here or speak there, whichever makes you more comfortable.
Active state intervention to properly cultivate the appropriate preconditions of liberal citizenship. And therein lies the contradiction, ladies and gentlemen. adopting a philosophical worldview predicated on the sanctity of individual autonomy and a constraint on sovereign power, Egyptian liberalism has from its inception been a project wedded to a deeply powerful central state. The rise of Gamal Abdel Nasser in the 1950s owes much to this incestuous relationship between liberalism and the Egyptian central state, as liberals, flummoxed at their inability to implement their project through the parliamentary process, ultimately endorsed the rise of a left-wing reformist dictatorship, or al-mustabid al-adil, the just tyrant in Arabic, to emerge and forcibly create the conditions of liberal citizenship and civil society, single-handedly inaugurate the modernist reforms they sought, and then benevolently step aside. With Nasser and the Free Officers movement, the liberals got their just tyrant, who proved anything but temporary. This is all, of course, a redaction I offer here, spelled out in far more detail in our book, but I submit that the illiberal proclivities of Egyptian liberal activists post-2013, particularly their antagonism toward the Muslim Brotherhood, owes much to the equally contradictory inheritances from their ancestors in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And perhaps most surprisingly of all, this contradictory status posturing by Egyptian liberals ultimately makes them bedfellows with their arch nemesis. Despite liberalism presenting itself as a bulwark against the forces of Islamism and the Muslim Brotherhood in particular, I argue that the two movements are ultimately philosophically tied to the hip on this fundamental basis, in that both are deeply wedded to an ideological statism. Here I offer a more detailed reading of the genealogies of liberalism, which I've done my best to streamline here, and I juxtapose it with a very close reading of the political philosophy of the Muslim Brotherhood, namely key treatises by its founder Hassan al-Banna and its major intellectual architect Said Qutb. In so doing, I uncover that, like Egyptian liberalism, the Muslim Brotherhood project is one equally beset by contradictions, in effect offering a project of reform that requires the guiding hand of an all-powerful central state to forcibly create the conditions for a proper Islamic society. Under such auspices, needless to say, the state apparatus takes on an authoritarian character. Ultimately then, Egyptian liberals share far more in common with their avowed arch nemesis in the Brotherhood than they're willing to admit. And to bring this conversation full circle, offering this juxtaposition allows us to see more clearly that just like the Brotherhood, in light of its most recent failures, needs to fundamentally revisit the origins of its political project and its ultimate aims, so does the project of liberalism in Egypt. If Egyptian liberals expect their project to have any long-term viability, they need to similarly wrestle with its internal contradictions and contextualize it beyond its classical Protestant origins in Europe in a way that does justice to the imminent social and cultural realities of Egypt. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'll end by offering a brief reading or a sentence from the end of my first chapter, in which I write, quote, "If Egypt and the contradictions of liberalism is to offer only one formative lasting critique, it is that the contradictions of the liberal experiment in Egypt can only be overcome by realigning the project to speak to the needs of the Egyptian people in a cultural, social, and yes, religious idiom that they find congruent." And with that, I'll end here, and I'll leave it to my colleagues to bring this conversation full circle. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daanish, for that excellent introduction or introductory remarks. Now we go to Dalia Fahmy. She's the co-author of the book, so we're starting with the two co-authors.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having us here. Thank you, Dr. Masmoudi, for being so generous in hosting this, and of course to my panelists for all coming in. You know, we live at a time where today it seems that breaking news breaks every 2 minutes in a speed with which what we wrote a year ago is both very dated but also extremely timely. And so the question becomes, how do we make sense of all of this? And if you look back at what Alexis de Tocqueville wrote in 162 years ago about the French Revolution, he says, revolutions are not always brought by a gradual decline from bad to worse. Nations that have endured patiently and most unconsciously the most overwhelming oppression have often burst into rebellion. Against the yoke, the movement, it began to grow lighter. The regime which is destroyed by a revolution is almost always an improvement on the immediate predecessor. And experience teaches the most critical moment for bad governments is the one witnesses the first steps towards reform. And so the question becomes, what happened in Egypt? When we go back and think about, it's going to be in 2 weeks that the revolution happened 7 years ago. The events leading up to... It's okay, I won't tell. The events leading up to the revolution and this transformative power, whether you call it a revolution or an uprising, really saw something different. We're seeing a lot of comparisons today to what happened in Iran, or what is happening in Iran, that I think are pretty false, because this is not it was not an economic revolution. What you saw was not just the middle class, but Muslims and Copts and liberals and conservatives and seculars and Islamists and the poor and the wealthy and the educated and the illiterate coming together calling for freedom and dignity and good governance and democracy, really institutional reform. This transformative moment lets us to question, how does a post-revolutionary transition take place, especially when non-democratic forces begin to further consolidate this? It's the elite, the intelligentsia, those that hold the most power at that moment. The independent of the state apparatus. The interesting thing is, after the critical transition or during, they became silent. And this cadre silence, complicit with what becomes a repressive military regime, runs counter to what we understand as democratic transition theory, which begs the question, why was the elite silent? What caused them to turn on the opposition that they were a part of in Tahrir Square? And so the impetus to put this project together was this big question of, we know what the role of the intelligentsia is, why did they kind of backtrack from that role? The role of also promoting an exclusionary narrative that we saw post-2012, 2013, is also part of the pursuit of this project. And so while Daanish looked at the kind of theoretical foundations, I, and I think some of my colleagues, are going to look at the institutional and structural dimensions. Because philosophical foundations, while they do give rise to institutions, what we also wanted to do is look at what happened to NGOs and student movements and civil society. And I will focus on the parliament and on elections and on real political parties, because it's these institutions that ultimately are supposed to guide and safeguard liberalism. So opposition movements in Egypt historically do enter politics because there's supposed to be an impact at the institutional level that ultimately would force structural change. Strong and robust political parties, we know, are really key to doing this in terms of development. Now, reform of those institutions was actually part of the call of the revolution. Not just good governance, but actually having a say in the government, real strong political parties. However, in Egypt, a multi-party system that would actually preserve a liberal democratic order was actually turning into a dysfunctional state. And so when we think about the weeks after the fall of Mubarak, people usually say in these post-revolutionary transition moments, there is a level of chaos. But it was right after the fall of Mubarak, within 6 weeks, by March of 2011, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces released a new law on political parties. And the new law required parties applying for registration to gather just 5,000 signatures from just 10 of the governorates of Egypt, and they would guarantee that their application would be reviewed in 30 days. And so what this does, it allows for the formation of dozens of political parties right at the outset. Now, one such party that was formed was the new democratic the Egyptian Democratic Social Party that was actually founded by Dr. Amr Hamzawi, who actually writes a chapter in our book, which is comprised of professionals and university professors. And there was an envisioning of a new party garnering the support of the Egyptians, both Muslim and Coptic, being represented by a prominent secular figures such as him and others, to ultimately articulate a new vision for Egypt. Just a few weeks after that, later in March, the secular Wef Party held a symposium for Egyptians of all secular walks, both old and new, to join forces and establish a new coalition. In the same month, March 2011, 73 members of the oldest leftist party, the Gamma Party, walked out of a party conference accusing the leadership of being too close to the remnants of the Mubarak regime, calling for the formation of a new party. They joined the Popular Alliance. It appeared for the first time within 6 weeks of the revolution that since President Gamal Abdel Nasser's of the Egyptian monarchy in 1952 that there could be a robust secular party system in Egypt. Now, when you get to the Islamists, when we usually think of opposition in Egypt, we usually think of the Muslim Brotherhood. But the other opportunity that happened at this moment was that they no longer had a monopoly on the use of the title of Islam. The first political party to be recognized by this new law, or founded, was February 19th of 2011. Just a week after the fall of Mubarak was the Center Party, or the Wasat Party, founded by Dr. Abul Alamadi. Two more parties are formed by former members of the Brotherhood, and so what you start to see is that internal pluralism is very much possible in a place like Egypt, right? And it happened within 6 weeks of the fall of Mubarak. And so when we think about all of this possibility, what happened to the parliament today, right? And I know I'm skipping over the dissolving of several parliaments. We have parliamentary members here, or former parliament members here. And so how do you get from that moment, right? Pluralism and articulation of alternate voices and a healthy atmosphere to what we have today. The new parliament today is nothing more than a return to a rubber stamp on the regime, but it's actually stripped of any of the dynamism of before. The gains made in the immediate aftermath of the 2011 uprising have been radically scaled back to the point that the current parliament is far from a site of any political participation and contestation. Now, in my own book, what I argue is that there is something to 2005, 2010 parliamentary cycle that happened in Egypt just before the revolution, where because of the robustness of this site, because of the membership of opposition movements, this became a site where political activity actually had to happen. There actually was political activity. And in some of the interviews I conducted, parliamentarians said because the 88 members of the Brotherhood who ran as independents, or because of this 22% level of independence within the parliament, all parliamentarians, especially those of the National Party, had to come to parliament as a counterbalance, even a little bit informed of what's happening. And so the C-SPAN equivalent of the channel that would actually come out of parliament had to actually at some point be turned off because of the level of review that was happening in these conversations. And so if you think about what that means in that short time period, that we actually had some level of political contestation and articulation in the parliament that led to the December 2000 election, which not a single member was reelected, which led to that really rigged election in December of 2011, it comes just on the heels of what? The January Revolution. And so I argue that there is a tie to this scare of what happened when there was a site where contestation was possible, and that becomes a threat to the regime. So let's look at this parliament today. It's an effectively neutered neutered of any political potential. The referendum that was endorsed by the January 2014 Constitution is supposed to give a level of legislative power and legislative oversight, but it also states that Parliament can be dissolved at any time, especially if it rejects a contingent of parliamentary candidates. It grants the president authority to declare a state of emergency without parliamentary approval. It strips the Egyptian parliament of authority to review appointments or budgets of key ministries, such as the Minister of Defense, Interior, and Justice. At the electoral level, the 2014 constitutional referendum eliminated the power of the upper house altogether. It increased the full roster of the parliament by 20% to 596 seats. 75% of those seats have to be for candidates without party affiliation. 75% are for candidates without party affiliation, thereby ensuring that no single party can have any significant parliamentary majority. 75%. It further mandates that 20% of parliamentary seats, 120 seats, be assigned to party list, assuring that the marginalization of any small parties. It also mandates that 5% of seats be appointed by the president himself, 28 members. Ultimately then, this parliament is constitutionally designed to serve little more than as a rubber stamp to the executive. Of the 120 seats available to party lists, the president himself called for the creation of a unified electoral list, which in effect undermined the competitive nature of any part of this political process. So the question becomes, where do we go from here? If we look simply at some of the laws that have been passed and some of the laws that are about to be passed, let's look at what kind of laws have been passed by this parliament so far. So first, laws that define terror extremely broadly, leading to sweeping control of society and rounding up members of society. Laws that criminalize NGO activity. Laws or amendments to the emergency laws that restrict rights. A law that makes demonstration illegal. A law that expands the president's power to appoint judges, weakening the independence of that institution. Laws that are being reviewed today include 3-year sentences to media that insult the state. Judges can reject defense witnesses, leading to no real appeal process for individuals. Internet censorship to punish government critics. A law that bans political activity, even political discussion, even in nawadi or clubs, right? You can't have these conversations. A law that targets political elites who can have citizenship withdrawn. Amending the nationality law, a law that is for labor laws that would severely hinder labor unions from being formed or actually functioning. And these are the kind of laws that are being reviewed today. And so when we think about where did we go from 2011 or from that time period of the pluralism of political parties to today, when not only are there no real political parties, but the site of the parliament is actually curtailing more of the rights, but more so the institution of the site of the parliament as an actual place where all of the ideological constructs of liberalism, led by interesting individuals, are being curtailed. And I hope that during the conversation, during the Q&A, we can talk about the coming election, right? Just announced on Monday, when it is and what it takes to run for office and who's a viable candidate, and what this is signaling for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dalia, for a really excellent presentation. Now we go to Sahar Aziz.
Back in DC and to see a lot of familiar faces. I appreciate the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy for hosting this important conversation. And I feel privileged to be part of the book project of Dr. Fahmy and Farooqi. So I do encourage you to read the book if you want to know more. And before I make my comments, I will just cite a couple articles that go into the minutia of what I research, because 8 to 10 minutes is simply not enough time to do justice to this very big topic. So a couple places to look: Independence Without Accountability, The Judicial Paradox of Egypt's Failed Transition to Democracy, Military Electoral Authoritarianism in Egypt, and my book chapter on judicial independence in Daanish and Dalia's book. So Egyptians are a resilient people who have persevered under the repression of many domestic and foreign rulers, most of whom have denied them the self-governance they deserve. Since 1952, these rulers have come from the Egyptian military, an institution vital for preserving national security and defending the nation in a conflict-ridden part of the world. However, just as civilians are not trained in national defense, neither are military officers trained in civilian governance that mandates negotiation, compromise, inclusion, pluralism, and individual rights and freedoms that collectively allow societies to thrive in the 21st century. Thus, it is long overdue for there to be sufficient political space for a professional class of civilian politicians, political parties, and civil society to develop and lead in Egyptian governance. When Egyptians went into the streets by the tens of millions on over 18 days, starting on January 15, 2011, they were demanding what they deserved: bread, freedom, and social justice. 7 years after this historic mass uprising, those of us who want to see Egypt thrive have learned many lessons. Among the most striking is the ease with which the deep state, comprised of security, police, and military institutions, were able to retain their firm grasp over Egyptian governance despite the desire of its people to self-govern. We also learned that civil society, political parties, and self-proclaimed political leaders were woefully unprepared to compete in the relatively more open political environment that followed the January 25th uprisings. In many ways, this should come as no surprise. as Nasser, Sadat, Mubarak ensured there was little political space for individuals and non-government institutions to professionalize in a manner that could oppose the authoritarians' political dominance. And any organizations that were able to institutionalize, such as the Muslim Brotherhood and its Freedom and Justice Party, despite a hostile political environment, were deemed threats to national security as a threat for their physical elimination at worst or their political exclusion at best. Hence, the political system and culture nearly guarantees the existence of a centralized authoritarian state that Egyptians bemoan, yet continue to persevere to the detriment of their nation's future. While there is plenty of blame to go around for the shattered hopes of Egyptians after 2011, I'd like to focus today on what can be done moving forward based on grievances I hear frequently by Egyptians when I visit Egypt, or Egyptians that are here visiting and they live there. And I preface my comments with a clear declaration that my objective is to seek ways to empower the diversity of Egyptians to self-govern in their national interest, as opposed to assist the U.S. in continuing its hegemonic influence over Egypt, support the policies of Israel, Saudi Arabia, or other regional powers, or assist the Egyptian military to control the nation's economy and government. So as such, I want to make three broad recommendations, policy recommendations, since we are in the policy capital of the country, for those who share my objectives. So first, there needs to be the creation of a political environment that does not punish those who dissent while professionalizing politics and civil society. And that second part, I think, is what we learned, the biggest lesson we learned after 2011. So rather than view the nonprofit sector with disdain and distrust, the government should acknowledge it as a resource for research, public education, and public debate on important policy issues. Similarly, political parties and politicians serve as an important check on government and on each other to decrease corruption, fraud, and misinformation. While there is some truth to the absence of skills and professionalization of politics in Egypt, it is not due to some inherent inferiority of Egyptians. I reject the false claim that Egyptians are not ready for democracy. Rather, the political chaos that ensued after 2011 was due to civilian inexperience by design and sabotage by strong state and international actors. Democracy is a process that requires an open political culture and a free press, among other institutions, to allow citizens to meaningfully self-govern as opposed to merely complain without a sense of empowerment. Second, I hear this very frequently from Egyptians, and I've been hearing it for decades, frankly. There needs to be more investment in the education system to allow Egypt's youth to take the nation's economy into the 21st century. As witnessed right here in the United States, when Egyptians have access to quality education and equal opportunity, they thrive. The global North has benefited tremendously from the talents of Egyptians, ranging from well-known figures like Ahmed Azawel, Mohammed Baradei, Dina Powell, Mohammed Al-Aryan, to the hundreds of thousands of doctors, engineers, lawyers, professors, and business people who work hard every day contributing to America's thriving economy. Indeed, according to the Egyptian government, education received only 11% of government spending in 2016 and 2017. Amounting to only 3% of GDP as compared to 6% of GDP in the US. Schools are dilapidated and classrooms severely overcrowded. Public school teachers earn so little that they rely primarily on fees from private lessons for their students to survive. And as a result, public education has become prohibitively expensive for the vast majority of Egyptians who cannot afford to put their children in private schools. Moreover, many Egyptians complain of the rote memorization and lack of critical thinking taught in Egyptian schools. If the current government is serious about returning Egypt to its status as a regional leader, it should be as concerned with improving the quality of public education as it is in building roads and bridges, which is what it always brags about doing, is infrastructure. Well, infrastructure without education and without experienced and skilled labor force doesn't get you very far. So the brain drain that Egypt has experienced for the past 5 decades has harmed Egypt's economic growth. The best and the brightest leave because of a poor educational system arising from corruption and unequal access to opportunity, among others. And in fact, many of us on this panel are a result of that brain drain, or at least our parents are. So by improving education and preserving the academic freedom to speak inconvenient truths, Egypt can stop exporting its most valuable asset, its people. Finally, I would be remiss as a law professor not to emphasize the importance of an independent judiciary in preserving the rule of law. And by rule of law, I mean open and fair hearings by unbiased and qualified judges, a degree of predictability and a limitation of arbitrariness of government action, and a level of individual rights and freedoms in accordance with international norms. Mass death sentences, military trials of civilians, and criminalizing youth dissidents do not comport with the rule of law. So while the Egyptian judiciary is among the most sophisticated in the Middle East, with many of its judges having trained other judges in Arab states, the judiciary is currently undergoing an intellectual transition, arguably for the worse. Law schools suffer from the same ill fate as other colleges, with thousands of students per class, resulting in overworked professors and a poor quality of education. Moreover, an increasing number of judges are graduates of the police academy, where they are trained to obey and serve in a hierarchical, security-focused structure. And family patronage, not necessarily the best qualifications, have heavily influenced a law graduate's appointment to the judiciary. Such factors were not as prevalent decades ago when Egypt's judges were among the nation's intellectual elite, and as a result, rule of law was much more established, as was judicial independence. And adding to the judiciary's challenges is an infrastructure that is in shambles, with dilapidated courts, few support staff, and an overwhelmingly high caseload for each judge. So for any country, such circumstances adversely impact the administration of justice to the detriment of the rule of law, both in public and private cases, mundane and high-profile cases. So for these reasons, it is long overdue for the Egyptian government to invest in a robust judicial training center that ensures only the best and brightest law graduates enter the judiciary. And any influence, direct or indirect, by the executive branch or the president on judges, particularly in high-profile cases, should cease. At a time when the vast majority of Egyptians are struggling to feed their family, due in large part to inflation hovering at 30% for the past 7 years, and the Egyptian pound dropping from 8 to 17 pounds to the US dollar last year, which cut everyone's savings in half and their salaries in half in a country where imports are there's a huge trade deficit to the advantage of imports. So Egyptians have succumbed to the reality that justice is still only available to the rich and powerful. But this need not be their destiny, nor should changing Egyptians' realities require another mass revolt. Indeed, as we've learned, a mass revolt may not get them what they want. The current regime, whose president is also a former general, like his predecessors, has a responsibility to create an open political environment that grants Egyptians a high-quality education, that teaches them critical thinking skills, allows the best to rise to the top in their fields rather than immigrate out of the country, and respect the rule of law beyond merely paying lip service to it. Bread, freedom, and social justice. Those were the three grand ideals that Egyptians sacrificed their life and liberty for, many of whom are now dead, disabled as a result of being shot in the eye or losing their limbs, or languishing in jail. Whether or not they want to call it liberalism or some other name, it's up to them to pursue those ideals. These are universal norms, and I hope that we, those of us here and in other places around the world who care about Egyptians, the people, who are effectively Egypt, the nation, they are comprised of the people, I hope that we will do what we can to support what they want and allow democracy to be shaped based on indigenous norms, and focus primarily on creating an environment that allows every citizen to act and to participate and to professionalize politics, so that the authoritarians can no longer use the excuse that if it's not us, it's chaos. If we don't rule, if the military doesn't rule, then there will be chaos and there will be a lack of security. And that need not be the case. Thank you.
Thank you, Sahar. Really outstanding presentations so far, and I'm sure that Shadi, Hamid will also give us an excellent wrap-up. So, Shadi.
So first of all, thank you, Radwan and CSID, for having us. So first of all, I would highly recommend the book. And the title is interesting, and maybe I'll use that as my jumping off point. It's available on Amazon, and it's relatively cheap. You should buy it, little plug. But so it's called Egypt and the Contradictions of Liberalism. So it is about Egypt, but it's also about something more, something broader, about in some ways, the inherent tensions between small L liberalism and small D democracy. And I'll maybe get to that a little bit more in a second, but I think an important point to highlight is to be a Democrat, to be someone who believes in the democratic idea, it's a learned skill, and it's not super easy to do. And I think that we as Americans think that it's easy because for us, liberalism and democracy have gone hand in hand, and even the way we talk about democracy, it's usually used as a shorthand for liberal democracy. So we haven't had to deal with those kinds of inherent tensions and the questions that maybe Egyptians and others in the Middle East had to deal with in light of the Arab Spring. That said, I think we as Americans have something to learn from the case of Egypt, and it's interesting that some of the rhetoric I've started to hear over the past year in the US about our own politics reminds me of conversations I would have in Egypt. And I'll just give you one example of this. I was talking to a friend of mine who, anti-Trump, he's on the left, he's a Democrat, and he was angry about Trump because he was reading some of the Fire and Fury excerpts, the Michael Wolff book that has just come out, and he sends me a text message and he's like, Shadi, we just have to get rid of this guy. And kind of out of nowhere, he just sent me that text. But he was implying that we should do it either through impeachment or invoking the 25th Amendment. And I tried to push back and tell him that I'm very uncomfortable with those ideas because Trump, as bad as he is democratically elected. I do consider him to be my president for better or worse. He is a legitimate representative of our country through electoral democracy. And that in some ways gets me to this tension is for the first time Americans have had to deal with the question of what happens if an illiberal Democrat comes to power through free and fair elections. And I think Donald Trump is quite unique in American history. I would argue he is the first illiberal Democrat we've had as our head of state. And what do I mean by illiberal Democrat? So basically, and I think that the other panelists have gotten at this in various ways, but let me just dial it down to kind of like a simple approach. So liberalism is about the classical liberal tradition, and it's about a set of non-negotiable rights and freedoms, an emphasis on individual agency and autonomy. So that's liberalism, the classical liberal tradition. On the other hand, we have small d democracy, which is more about reflecting and representing the popular will, usually through majorities, depending on the exact system. But generally speaking, the idea is that citizens vote for their representatives, and those representatives then are responsible for policy making. But it's possible in a democracy that you can vote for people who do not believe in the classical liberal tradition. And that can include ethno-nationalists, it can include white nationalists, it can include Islamist movements. And the Muslim Brotherhood is an example of a group that committed itself to the democratic process, but doesn't believe in the ideological or philosophical tradition of Western liberalism. And we also have examples of the Hindu far right coming to power through free elections in India. You could even argue the Israeli government is quite democratic, but illiberal in the sense that Arab Israelis are second-class citizens in various ways. The Philippines under Duterte. The list goes on. Poland under Law and Justice, Viktor Orban in Hungary. These are all examples of people who came to power through free and fair means. They were elected by either a majority or a plurality, but they are not liberals. So in that sense, what we're talking about is a universal phenomenon, and I think we in the West are being tested. And I think that's why you'll hear more and more what I consider to be anti-democratic rhetoric from my colleagues and friends on the left, on the Democratic side. I'm on the left. I think Trump is a terrible president. But again, we have to make distinctions between whether someone is terrible and whether they have to be pushed out of office through, let's say, military coups or even a kind of legal coup or a constitutional coup. So that's that's one thing I wanted to sort of emphasize. I do want to challenge, though, some of my fellow panelists, and maybe we can talk about this more in the Q&A, is that if I think about this sometimes, if I was a liberal in Egypt, born and raised in Egypt, what would I have done during the 2013 coup and then the subsequent Rabaa massacre? It's not obvious to me that I would have made the right decision. I can imagine myself that if I was an Egyptian liberal, I would have supported the coup. I think it's actually understandable, however bad it is. So I'm not justifying it, but I'm saying from a liberal perspective, it's understandable why they did what they did. And I think there's also precedents if you look at 18th and 19th century European liberals who were very suspicious of mass politics and mass democracy, and some of them actually supported post-1848 counter-revolutions. So you might recall there were the 1848 revolutions. Many so-called European liberals actually became counter-revolutionaries, and this is something they discuss in the book as well. And why? Because they were suspicious of what the masses would do if there would be universal suffrage. Why? Because they believed that liberalism was an elite project that had to come from the top, and over time, liberalism had to sort of be infused in the masses, and that would be a long process, and only then could people be trusted to vote for their representatives. But before that, democracy was a dangerous thing. So in that sense, this is not the first time we've seen people do this. There is a history there, and there are precedents. And that's how I make sense of, so I'm born and raised here in the US, and I was a very outspoken critic of the coup and of the Rabaa massacre. Almost my entire family in Egypt supported the coup, and in some cases supported the massacre, and I found this to be, you know, an intriguing question. And I mean, I don't think people in my family are evil. I don't think they're uniquely bad people. I don't like all of them, but some of them are dear to me, some of them I love, and it was a challenge to make sense of how could they come to support the mass killing of their fellow countrymen. Let's put that aside and let's just talk about the coup. And I think there we have to at least try to understand why so-called liberals did what they did. I think part of it is they rightly thought that they wouldn't be able to win in free and fair elections for the foreseeable future. There was such a profound electoral imbalance, and that's different than many other countries where you see more of a balance in society. And I think Tunisia might be one of the few exceptions in the Middle East where there was a stronger secular tradition. There were secular and socialist parties that maybe had more support than they had in Egypt. But what happens when Islamists, Brotherhood and Salafis win about 70% of the seats? That can be very intimidating because you're like, hey, we might not be able to win because liberalism doesn't have a kind of inherent constituency in Egyptian society. There aren't many liberals in Egypt. There aren't many secularists in Egypt, secularists who want to kind of keep the role of religion at least somewhat limited. There aren't a lot of people like that in Egypt on the mass level. So if you don't believe the masses are with you, then you're going to look for ways outside of the democratic process to make sure your liberal ideas are protected, or at least to make sure that Islamists don't dominate for the foreseeable future. And it's possible that they would. I mean, I think that Islamists generally, Brotherhood plus Salafis, probably would have done fairly well in elections for the foreseeable future. Even if they went down from 70% to 55% or 70% to 50%, that's still a majority. So I think that then, so I'll just end here, and what do we do about that? And I think one of the questions that Dalia and Daanish pose in the first chapter of the book, I think they have a subheading that is titled, "Can Liberalism be an emancipatory force in the Middle East?" Is there a way to sort of rethink or reconstitute Egyptian liberalism or liberalism in the Arab world that liberalism can make its peace with democracy? And they offer a kind of some ideas of how that might come to be. I'm actually quite pessimistic. I actually don't think I'm very skeptical it's even possible. Now we can talk about it from a philosophical standpoint and say Egyptians should do this and we would wish they do this, But I see no sign, knowing what I know about Egyptian politics, that Egyptian liberals are going to come to terms with the democratic process unless they feel they actually have a chance to win. But even then, I'm not entirely sure. So, and I think it speaks very badly that in Egypt, with maybe, we keep on bringing up Amr Hamzawi as one of the few liberals we can come up with. And when we played this very sad game after the coup. How many liberals can we think of, prominent liberals in Egypt, who opposed the coup? And usually, we came up with 3 or 4, and Amr Hamzawi was always one of them. That's literally all you can come up with. It was Amr Hamzawi and maybe 2 other people, which is a very sad state of affairs. So with that in mind, I guess I would pose the question to my fellow panelists, but also to folks in the audience. You know, you can't change, how do you change people, or how do you change liberals and get them to actually fundamentally transform themselves into committed Democrats who are willing to accept the results of elections? I don't know how you do it. But I think one thing, and I'll just close with this, 2 possible ways forward, and I think this is actually something you hear from some members of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, is that there could be, perhaps, if there's a political opening in 10 or 15 years in Egypt, or maybe in 30, maybe in 5, I don't know, but that there would be an interim period where the Brotherhood and whatever parties are tied to the Brotherhood would be very careful about not contesting. They would, in a sense, lose on purpose, at least in the beginning, to give liberals and secular parties a chance to compete and to build up their party organizations and to avoid a kind of polarization. Another option is to sort of table Sharia and divisive national identity issues and religious identity issues and say, we are not going to deal with Sharia during the interim period. And we're going to wait, we're going to get there once the transition is safe and secure. And the last thing I'll say is on the state, and I think Daanish alluded to this, is that there is an obsession with the state on both sides of the political spectrum in the Arab world, but particularly in Egypt, an obsession with state power. And people can't even think of politics outside of the conception of the state. And that was, I think, a big problem in the transition, that people were panicking over who would be president because the president is such a powerful figure in a centralized system like Egypt. So everyone wanted that prize. And it was very hard to let it go and say, we're going to let someone else win the presidency. So the question, I think, for the Arab world going forward, and particularly for Egypt, is how do we move from this very state-centric approach? How do we encourage decentralization? How do we encourage local politics? How do we, in a sense, weaken the state so people are not so obsessed with gaining the state and using the state as an engine for either liberalism or Islamization? Because I think that was the fear on both sides, that whoever wins the state can then use the state and the state apparatus to reshape society at large. So I'll end there, and thank you.